connected deaths that took place in association with patients who filled their prescription at a very specific pharmacy in Chicago. And so this ties into what we're talking about here with cellular respiration, because after the officials investigated these sudden and mysterious deaths following patients who had been shopping or filling prescriptions at this pharmacy, they ended up finding out that the Tylenol capsules that were sold at this location were actually laced with cyanide, okay? And so these patients all reported similar findings, that they had a headache. They went to this pharmacy, either filled or received or bought over-the-counter Tylenol capsules, and then they ended up dying within the next couple hours. How this ties in has to do with the function of cyanide, and then going back to our drawing here, our image here of oxidative phosphorylation. So what I'll say about cyanide is that cyanide blocks cytochrome C. So cytochrome C is one of the transporters that we talked about that were present in the inner mitochondrial membrane. It was one of the transporters that allowed for the passing of electrons, but also the flow of hydrogen ions from the matrix out into the intermembrane space. So having said that, having made that connection that cyanide blocks cytochrome C, what do you think would be the result of ingesting cyanide? Give me some of your thoughts. Drop them in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and chat if you want. What would you suspect or predict would be the issue or the problem or the presenting complaint from a patient if they were to ingest cyanide? Having said all that we've said about oxidative phosphorylation and about cyanide. I'll give you a few minutes to ponder on that. So let's do 2 minutes, and then we'll discuss. All right, so I'm seeing some comments coming in. ATP would not be able to be synthesized. Absolutely correct. So you're on the correct path here. Any other thoughts? Any other connections? How might this patient look? How might they present before they actually expire? Awesome. So fatigue or lack of energy could be some presenting symptoms. Absolutely. Yep. Any other thoughts? Okay, so you're absolutely correct. Some of the presenting complaints from these patients were fatigue, inability to breathe, lack of oxygen, basically suffocating, or they would also present with just generalized weakness, fogginess. Some of them went into a coma, slipped into a coma before they expired. And so this is all tying back to the inability to produce ATP. So what happens with cyanide, and cyanide was actually intentionally designed or created after World War II as a way for captured soldiers to commit suicide to end their life in a very painless, seamless, quick way. So it was made with that intent, and that is why it acts on the electron transport chain, because it blocks or stops the transfer of electrons. And what that does is it basically halts the electron transport chain. If we can no longer pass the electrons one to the other, we end up blocking the chain in this one spot, and then we can't pass those electrons on to oxygen. So even in the presence of oxygen, these patients will have symptoms of suffocating because oxygen is not playing its usual role, because electrons are no longer being passed from complex to complex across the membrane. And so it's just like suffocating, just like the inability to breathe oxygen, the same sort of presenting symptoms, but it's really acting on the mitochondria, on the specific complex, and halting the transfer of these electrons. Okay, so really interesting connection there with cyanide. This is why it's so deadly, and this is why it was actually created in the first place. All right, any questions from that case? Any questions from that? All right, the final couple of things regarding glucose oxidation has to do with the way that glucose is catabolized in the absence of oxygen. So we talk about what can happen regarding utilizing oxygen, regarding driving the electron transport chain. But let's say we have a scenario where there's very little oxygen coming in. If there's low oxygen, the electron transport chain is going to back up. So very similar to what we said here. If we have no oxygen, the electron transport chain will back up, right? It will halt. And so what we're going to see is that glycolysis will be able to still be conducted. The Krebs cycle will stop because we can no longer pass electrons through the chain. So if we're no longer passing electrons through the chain, the other components that are generating those electrons will also halt, right? So the Krebs cycle. The only stage of glucose oxidation that will continue is glycolysis. Okay, is glycolysis. So we'll be able to continue driving glycolysis in the scenario where we are able to oxidize NADH. And in doing so, we actually synthesize lactate. All right, so let's look at this scenario here. So here's glycolysis happening. Here are all of the NADH, NADH plus, right? These electrons that we are liberating or making by reducing NADH to NAD+. And if we're, making the NADH via the enzyme lactate dehydrogenase, we can generate as a byproduct here, we can convert that to lactate, we can convert pyruvate to lactate. Because remember, at this point, electron transport chain has stopped because it needs oxygen. Krebs cycle has stopped because it needs oxygen. So glycolysis is the only one that is continually producing pyruvate. And that pyruvate is not going to build up, it's going to get converted to lactate. And in doing so, we're going to go ahead and oxidize the NADH plus back into the NAD+, okay? So by doing this, we can quickly use up that pyruvate so it doesn't start building up. But as a price, we're going to build up lactate. Anyone know what lactate does? What does lactate or lactic acid do inside our body? Has anyone ever heard of lactate building up in your muscles? Yeah, so it helps muscles to recover pretty quickly so that they can make more ATP via glycolysis really fast. But that lactate is actually very acidic. And so what it does is it gives this burn in the muscles. So if you've ever been running or sprinting, any type of activity where you had to generate a lot of muscle contraction very quickly. So sprinting is probably the best example, or lifting something heavy very quickly. You're going to rely mainly on glycolysis to do so, but as a result of you not bringing in enough oxygen, you're going to convert most of that pyruvate to lactate, and that is going to create that burn that you feel inside your muscles, whether it be your quads and your hamstrings if you're sprinting, or your biceps and triceps if you're lifting a heavy weight or heavy object. So this is why we are able to make a lot of ATP, not a lot, but a little bit of ATP quickly using glycolysis to power quick contractions. But we also have that price to pay, which is the buildup of lactate, which is what helps to keep the process going in the absence of oxygen.